The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 9th chapter. Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. The Gospel of the Lord. Transfiguration Sunday is an odd church festival. Now my hunch is that most people don't really understand it much at all. I mean, this strange moment when Jesus took a few of his disciples, walked up a hill, and there was transformed before them. The implication being that suddenly this great light begins to emanate from Jesus' body. His face changes, and his clothes become whiter than clothing in any bleach commercial. The disciples see it with their own eyes. Or as Paul puts it in a few verses in 2 Corinthians, "For it is the God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ." This is a significant moment for the disciples. And Luke, the gospel writer for today, records it between 2 conversations that Jesus has with his disciples. 2 conversations when Jesus talks about his suffering and his death. In other words, the transfiguration, that experience, comes as this jolt of encouragement, a shot in the arm, a booster shot even to inoculate them from the fear and the confusion of those coming last days in Jerusalem, where literally all hell would break loose, where Jesus would be tried, suffer horrible abuse, and be tortured and die on a cross. The disciples get this glimpse of glory, something to sustain them on the long and difficult road ahead. Well, perhaps the same has been true for you. When you've had some sort of momentary, often too fleeting moment where you've seen beneath life's surface or through the facade of this apparent reality to something much more deep. A moment you have beheld something so beautiful, so profound, so wonderfully moving that you could only attribute it to God. Now maybe we've all had moments when we, like the disciples, have in our own hearts seen the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Maybe you haven't even called it that. You just knew that there was an experience, a moment in time when suddenly the veil of this life lifted and something transformative took place, a conversion moment for you, and somehow everything on the other side of that moment was different. Or that moment or experience became an encouragement, a reminder of what really matters, something that could sustain you, at least for a while. And so it was for the disciples there on the mountain. They could face the days ahead because now they knew, and more than knew, had experienced the fullness of God's glory. They had seen with their own eyes that this Jesus that appeared to them to be so human was more than just an ordinary man, that within him was the light and the power of God, just as they had suspected, just as they had hoped. They could always go back to these moments on the mountaintop and remember. But not just in a nostalgic sort of way. You know, nostalgia can be a dangerous form of remembering because it can steal the pleasure out of the present and discount the blessings of this day. Nostalgia longs to return to the old days or to a better before than what we know now. It's the attitude of Peter that seeks to deny current reality, opting instead for a moment that could be frozen in time. In the words of the gospel lesson, Peter exclaims, "Oh, it's so good to be here. Let's make 3 dwellings. And we can all just live up here on the mountain. Let's hang on to this moment. No more talk, Jesus, of your suffering and death. Let's just stay here forever." Why is it that the most beautiful moments in life go by so quickly? Especially lately in a world full of great anxiety. Maybe the pandemic is waning, hopefully. Even Palm Springs now, one of the last holdouts of safety protocols, is relaxing its posture. It didn't take long, though, did it, for another fear or concern to replace the previous one when it comes to our global awareness. The invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces has profound implications. The stability-instability paradox says that other world powers won't get involved militarily, because to do so would risk World War III, or a war between countries that now have nuclear capability. That stability allows for Putin to go in without military interference or resistance from countries like the US. This, of course, creates instability for Ukraine, thus the stability-instability paradox. But what does the world do with a tyrant, a dictator, a despot like Putin? And if he takes the Ukraine, what country will he go after next? Please, can't we just hold on to the beautiful moments in life like Peter wanted to? Why do we have to deal with the realities of the day? Nostalgia longs to return to a time of the past when we didn't have to have all these problems. When it comes to the challenges we face these days in the human family, though, nostalgia will not serve us well. But there is a place for remembering. As much as we'd like to, we can't hang on to life's most beautiful moments. They slip through our fingers far too quickly. We want to go back to them, but even that is difficult as it is to even return to a life before a pandemic. But remembering, pulling a past experience forward into the present, the opposite of retreating into the past, that can be very powerful and helpful. The biblical writers certainly engage in this form of remembering. Passover is a holiday of memory, passing down the story of God's deliverance of Israel from one generation to the next. The psalmists recall with thanksgiving what God has done in their lives and the lives of their people. Paul remembers with thanksgiving the people dear to him in the congregations he has planted and started. And of course, Jesus tells his disciples, when they gather to eat the bread and drink the wine, to do it in remembrance of me. In other words, in remembering is something very powerful. We pull the past into the present, and the moment of Christ breaking bread among us becomes as real as when Christ broke bread for his disciples. Remembering has the power to do that, not nostalgia. Black History Month is certainly not about nostalgia, but about remembering. Today we recognize that all of February has been Black History Month. Black history is everyone's history. Just as there has never been humanity without black people, there is no human history without black history. Now this doesn't mean we simply fall into some nostalgic remembrance of past events, but rather recognize that black history was made last century, last summer, last night, right now. Black history is being made always. Black History Month is a time to educate ourselves about black achievements. Not just prominent persons like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Harriet Tubman, persons we've all heard of, but persons who have also shaped our local communities as well. People like Paul R. Williams, the first certified African-American architect west of the Mississippi. He lived in Los Angeles, but is known for being one of the major contributors to the modernist development of Palm Springs. This past week was Modernism Week. Big deal here. Well, in 1952, Williams completed a remodel to the glamorous El Mirador Hotel of that day, including the 60-foot Spanish Revival bell tower that became and still is a Palm Springs landmark. The hotel eventually closed, was converted into the hospital we know as Desert Regional, a throwback to the days the hotel was used as a military hospital in World War II. And the tower in front of that hospital stands as a tribute to Williams, just one of many persons of the Black community that have helped shape the rich and diverse history of Palm Springs. We also, on this day, remember the injustices our Black and brown sisters and brothers have faced over the centuries, and that still horrible injustices continue to be inflicted today upon people of color. Not far from the El Mirador Tower is a set of 4 gates in a neighborhood that have been the center of controversy. Many believe they stand as a symbol of racism in our community, which has left lasting scars on the community of Palm Springs. Well, in 1989, more than 60% of the property owners on one side of those gates put forth a petition requesting that the gates be installed. And the gates were eventually completed, funded by a special tax assessment paid by the 40 property owners on the 4 streets, turning the 4 streets into cul-de-sacs and strategically separating neighbors on this side from neighbors on the other side. Well, the neighbors on the one side say that the gates were erected to combat vandalism, vagrancy, and crime. But there are plenty who think the construction of these gates were racially motivated in order to block city streets and prevent people living on the other side in nearby apartment buildings, including many residents of color, from walking or driving through the neighborhood to go to schools, parks, and stores. Well, last year in March, the gates were modified by the city council with your tax dollars. And while the streets are still blocked by the gates, you can now at least walk through an opening on the side of them. It's important to remember these things. They become the motivation for us to recognize the profound ways persons of color have shaped and continue to shape our lives. They also encourage us, challenge us to go further in removing those barriers that separate us as human beings and prevent us from experiencing and celebrating inclusion and diversity. Remembering helps us overcome our reluctance to also recognize the deep roots of systemic racism that still permeates so much of our society, and to own up to our own support of any system that marginalizes any human being, that even hints at saying that one person, because of their race, gender, sexual identity, sexual expression, nationality, even political affiliation, has less value than another. On a day like this, we may also remember the words of Nelson Mandela, who reminds us of the strength of those who know racial oppression, or any oppression for that matter. The greatest glory in living lies not in never failing, he writes, but in rising every time we fall. And then there are the words of the Reverend Dr. King that remind us of just how far we still need to go until the dream is realized. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. It was the glory of the Lord that was revealed to the disciples on the mountain that day when Jesus' face shone like the sun, and it was that experience for them that sustained them when things would get tough. We too have our little glimpses of glory that sustain us, that keep us engaged in the ongoing struggle of equality and justice, especially for people of color. Those momentary beams of light shine again as we remember them. Our first reading today says, "Since then we have such a hope. we act with great boldness. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And all of us, seeing the glory of the Lord as though reflected in a mirror, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. Therefore, it continues, since it is by God's mercy that we are engaged in this ministry, we do not lose heart. And so on this Transfiguration Sunday, I encourage you to remember with joy and thanksgiving those mountaintop experiences that have formed your faith, that have formed you as a child of God, that have enabled you to move through moments of difficulty in your own life. And remember and learn more about your black history too, for it belongs to us all as human beings. And to remember the beautiful accomplishments and the moments or glimpses of glory that have been part of that history, not just for the sake of nostalgia, but as empowerment and encouragement for the struggles and the difficulties that still lie ahead. Life, by and large, is not lived on the mountaintops, and certainly all does not yet gleam in glory. Sorry, Peter, you can't spend forever up there in that beautiful moment. But the memory of those mountaintop experiences can help sustain us in hard times. And those memories can help us train our eyes and our ears to perceive God's work in the more ordinary places of life. And through our own lives and the work that we do together, to perhaps even be able to see the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. Amen.
King Jesus, no man can hinder thee. Ride on, King Jesus, ride on, no man can hinder thee. For he is King of kings, he is Lord of lords. Jesus Christ, the first and last, no man works like him. For he is King of kings, he is Lord of lords. Jesus Christ, the first and last, no man works like him. King Jesus rides a milk-white horse, no man works like him. The journey did cross, no man works like him. For he is King of kings, Lord of lords. Oh, Jesus Christ, the first and last. Oh, King Jesus rides in the middle of the air. Oh, he calls the saints from everywhere. Oh, ride on, King Jesus. No